Take your seats. Okay, good morning, everybody. Just a couple of navigation points so we finish up the first full week of the course. Next week, we go to a relatively normal schedule, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. We're going to move into some world perspectives on international order, China, Russia, Europe, and then we're going to take a look at ISIL and Daesh in the Middle East. We'll have 3 speakers next week, which is a little more than usual, but we had an opportunity to host the Latvian foreign minister, so we've added him to give us the European perspective. But that'll mean we have a little less time in seminar next week, so try and make it as productive as possible. Okay, today we have a rare treat. Our speaker is our colleague and yours, Colonel retired Bob Colella. Most of you know Bob. Maybe there are some things you don't know about him. He's a career Air Force pilot. Spent a lot of time, he didn't say how many hours because he's too modest, but a lot of time in the B-52, in the B-2 stealth bomber. So when it comes to energy, he certainly knows the consumption side of the energy equation. He was a distinguished graduate here at the National War College as a student in 2006. He joined the faculty in 2008 while still on active duty, spent 3 years on active duty on the faculty, retired from here, and was hired back as a civilian faculty member. He's taught in the Corps, he's taught in the elective. Many of you maybe are in his elective with Dr. Teresa Sabonis-Helf on energy and the environment. It's a very popular elective for many years now. And he really has developed a deep and broad expertise in energy issues. So we're going to look at energy as sort of something that fuels certain interactions in the international environment. Keep in mind, again, our levels of analysis. There are state players involved, non-state players, energy multinationals, the big majors. Remember, in some countries, they're controlled by the government. In other countries, they're not. So we have a mix of key players involved in this. And what we want to look at is, sort of what's the state of play and then how things might change. And my seminar has been merciless about saying none of us can predict the future. And I've now come to agree with them. But we can at least try and understand how it's shaping up and where certain trends are. And this is what we're hoping to do in the energy lesson. Now, as customary among colleagues, I said to Bob a day or two ago, I said, listen, your bio's on the web page for sure, but people are kind of modest in their bios on the web page. I said, why don't you send me, something by email? So he did, and I just want to make sure I didn't forget anything. Yes, the last line, he said, and I read, Bob is my personal hero, and he's also a fellow Red Sox fan. So, Bob, take it away.
Good morning. I see some of you did not make it with the traffic accident. So to all the folks down in Dible, big shout out to you. And I think, Juanita, you're going to tweet this out, right? So people who are stuck in traffic, you're going to, absolutely attribution. So what are people afraid of? Me, great white sharks, Mrs. Colella. But a lot of the world is afraid of 2 things: being cold and being in the dark. So this is a unique picture for 2 reasons. One, it was taken during a total solar eclipse, obviously. But secondly, if you look at it, it's going to tell you where the first world countries are and where the third world countries are. And for first or emerging world nations, one has to wonder how long a government can last without a secure flow of energy. So, Terrence, I just hit this guy here, right? There we go. Did I get it? There we go, good. Okay, so this is an overview of what we're going to talk about today, and since you've all seen there's 67 slides, we'll just skip right through this one. Good. So, in a world of interconnected markets, it's nearly impossible to isolate yourself from the global energy market. So when you hear the term energy independence, you should immediately be suspect that someone's trying to sell you something that doesn't exist. Because what you're really after in the world is energy security. And we're going to talk about how to measure that. If you're a net consumer of energy, you care about where you're going to get your energy from. If you're a net producer, you likely don't produce everything you need. And while you can consume your own resources, the pressure to export them is great, as a global market will pull as prices almost compel entry into the export market. And that's the second picture you see up here. You know, as much as we may become more energy proficient and we may produce more, the pressure to export it will be great on even the United States. So for developing countries, the question you ask is, can you convert those newfound resources into competitive exports? Or will you trade the resources themselves for cash to hasten the development of your own country with an infusion of hard currency? Ultimately, decisions about trading your resources for cash on the open market become questions of sovereignty. You can only trade a barrel of oil one time. For those who are importing, economic prosperity, quality of life, and effectiveness of governance are all dependent upon the ability to secure and maintain a steady flow of energy. So interruptions to both flow and sources are considered threats to national security for any developed or developing nation. So questions about energy security are really about how to secure your own energy needs within this very complicated global environment where both competition among those who are trying to purchase as well as those who are trying to sell leads to very interesting approaches to cooperation that lead to achieving energy security. So, let's go to the next slide. Good. Okay. So this slide here, and we have a lot of slides and a lot of data, because energy is actually kind of fun. There's a lot of great places to go look for data for wherever countries you're traveling to or studying, and it's very revealing to look at it. So we're going to do a little bit of that today so you get a chance to see it. So this slide is showing you, basically, in a percentage fashion, how much a country produces divided by how much it consumes. Got that, PJ? It's like a math thing, okay? You got it, okay, good. So, what do all these countries have in common? And these are countries we're going to look at today. United States, Germany, France, China, and Japan. What it's telling you is that all of them are net energy importers because they're not self-sufficient. They need someone else to bring energy to their shores or to their country. So a couple interesting things to look at here are China. So around sometime in 2000, you can see at 100, right, it means that basically they're self-sufficient. But sometime around 2000, China was no longer self-sufficient. They started to import energy. And that changed some things in the world, and we're going to see that later. Something else that's interesting is when you look at Japan in 2010, something happened there, right? Fukushima happened there. And they became far less energy sufficient because they turned off all their nuclear generating capacity. You can see France and Germany hover around 50%, and you can see where the United States sits. And in fact, the United States is interesting because why? That arrow or the line is going up, which means what? We're producing more. Now, it could be the case that you're consuming more, right? Back to the math thing, but numerators and denominators. But the bottom line is any country you see here that's below 100 is someone who's got to import energy. Now, being above the line would be great, but it also comes with its own problems. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are energy secure if you're above the line. If you're above the line, you're probably exporting, and you need markets, and you need customers on the other side to purchase your energy. So, what does a nation's energy basket of risk look like? Because really, at the end of the day, what you are doing as a nation is you're taking on some risk, you're taking on some cost in order to secure your energy needs. So part of the question is, what are your natural endowments as a country? The United States, we have a lot of coal. We're finding out that we have some gas and we have some oil. But then there's what you need, because every country's transportation sector pretty much needs to have petroleum. They need to have oil in order for it to go. What can you buy? How far away is it? What can you sell? What can you build, right? What can you imagine? So what you're seeing here is a representation of assumption of some economic risk, because economic prosperity is tied to the ability to get energy in order to fuel it. It's political risk. When the lights go out, people tend to vote not for the party in power. And it's even a measure of military risk. Think about what you read about last night with respect to England making the decision to convert from coal to oil for its navy. Did they have any oil? No, right? So they were taking a gamble because they thought that it would be a much more efficient way to run their navy But at the end of the day, if they couldn't get that oil, the Navy wasn't going to get to go too far. So what does that mix look like in the United States? So this, again, is an eye chart, but don't let it scare you. Because all I'm really trying to show you is that for every country you look at, on the left-hand side, there's a mix of what they use. So for us, you see that there's oil. You see that there's natural gas in blue. You see that there's coal. You see there's some renewables. And on this chart, renewables equates to both hydroelectricity as well as the things that we're more familiar with that are more modern, right? Like solar and wind and things like that. But when you're looking at a lot of these charts, remember that renewables do include hydro, which can be kind of confusing when you look at the big picture of it, and nuclear. Now, I just draw your attention to where I've highlighted it here. You know, where does 70% of all the oil that comes into this country go? It goes into the transportation sector of our economy. If you look at the transportation sector, you see that what? 92% of all the transportation in this country relies upon oil. So that's all it's showing you. And these are going to change country by country, but it's a mix, and it's a measure, and it's a visualization, if you will, of the risks that a country is willing to take in order to provide for its energy security. All right, go to the next one. Sometimes when we look at the slides that follow, we're going to be looking at the energy mix within a certain sector. Most often it'll be when we talk about electric generation. Okay, so energy security. You read last night in Elkin's reading that there's 4 elements that you want to consider: availability, reliability, affordability, and sustainability. Now, this is good for you as National War College strategists because it's an ability check, right? You guys know how to do that. So you're all set. So when you look at availability, what you're asking yourself is, do you have the resource available? Do you have markets that you can connect suppliers with consumers? It's physical resources. In the United States, it's coal. We have a lot of coal that's available. And coal's great, right? Because what happens when coal spills on the ground? What do you do with it? You pick it up and you put it back in the basket. That's right. And if you know the answers, just shout them out, okay? Okay. You pick it up, you put it back in the basket, and off you go. Reliability, what does that mean? It means it's available without interruption. No, can someone else turn off your supply? How secure is your route to getting it? For the United States, with coal, it's trains, right? But for a lot of cases, countries that are importing, it's those lines of communication. It might be a pipeline. How reliable are they? How diverse are they? Do you have diversity in both supply as well as the transportation method? Those are the things that you care about. Is it affordable? And this is an interesting question because a lot of times what we focus on is affordability. But in reality, you have to ask yourself, would you rather your prices be predictable, or would you rather suffer the volatility that goes along with prices going up and down? Volatility makes it very hard to plan, especially if you're an exporter. Cheap does not necessarily equal energy security because oftentimes cheap energy fails to convey the full impact of the energy use. And also the expectation of low prices encourages consumption. It discourages investment in production and makes buyers vulnerable to price shocks. And when expectations prove wrong, people tend to get upset. It also leads to less innovation. And money goes away from investment in new technologies. It's also less efficient. So let's look at some examples of how countries look at how they're going to secure their own energy security, because that'll help you understand how some of these ilities come into play. So let's look at France first. Jean, pay attention. Okay, so this is the overall picture for what France's energy basket looks like. And you can see there's a little bit of coal at the very bottom, but not a whole lot because France doesn't have a lot of coal. There's oil, but that's really going to be in the transportation sector. There's some natural gas. There's a whole lot of nuclear. There's a little bit of hydro and a little bit of renewable. Now, the nice thing about nuclear energy is it's available because it sits in your country, and it's reliable. You can stockpile a year's worth of fuel on site. So think about that. You have a year's worth of fuel for your generation plant sitting there on site at any one time. So France is focused on energy that's available and energy that's reliable. And they sacrifice affordability because nuclear energy is expensive, and sustainability because over the long term, you got to figure out what you're going to do with all that waste. There's a long-term cost to nuclear energy. And again, Europe is a region that relies heavily on imports. And as we're going to see, they do so in part to avoid entanglements of transit states and sources. So let's look just at France's electricity generation, like that sector. And that's what it looks like. Now that's interesting, right? Because between 1972 and 2008, you see about a 100% increase in the use of electricity in France, but it's all coming from nuclear energy. And they've actually squeezed out almost all the petroleum that's in their electric grid. There's very little natural gas, there's very little oil, and there's very little coal. Now, what's the downside to having an energy grid that looks like this with nuclear energy? Well, here's a demand curve of a typical day in a summertime setting where you have air conditioning. And you can see that the demand for energy goes up and down throughout the day. It peaks out sometime around 6 o'clock in the evening when everybody comes home and they're cooking dinner and they've got the washing machine going and the dishwasher going and the television going. And then it starts to peter off at night. And then sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, it bottoms out. Well, if you've got a nuclear power plant, what do you do when the demand drops like that? So where's slow learner? Slow, do you just turn it off? Just turn off that plant? You got to leave it running because otherwise it explodes, right? Right? And that's bad, right? So, yeah, it's in the winter time. So, where do you do with these electrons? Well, in a very counter-historical fashion, the French electrons invade Germany. And you're going to see why next. But where is Jean? You're in the room somewhere? There you are. Yes. And they're right next to each other. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yes. Comrades. But they do. So at night, France basically gives away, pretty much gives away its electricity. Exactly. Exactly. France has encouraged Germany because we're not working 35 hours a week, right? Right? So we export all those electrons to Germany. Germany uses them in industry. They've encouraged Germany to basically run industry at night. And so that's how France has taken care of its energy security. They've essentially brought it all internally to themselves. Now, what if every country in Europe did that? It doesn't work because you've got to have some place you can shed those electrons to. You've got to get rid of them. You just can't turn a nuclear power plant on and off. It's not scalable. Natural gas plants you can. And in fact, that's how we take care of peak energy demands in the United States. We have natural gas sitting right next to the coal-fired plants, and you just turn them on as you need it, and you turn them off as you don't. So it's scalable. Now, so that's interesting. So let's look at Germany because they're really interesting. So here's Germany. Germany imports just about all their energy. They import 87% of its gas. 40% of that, 87%, comes from Russia. They import 98% of their oil. They have some coal. Hold on a second. But it's brown coal. So they actually import a lot of coal as well. So what is Germany to do? Well, Germany has decided that they're going to squeeze out nuclear out of their grid. And they're going to push to a grid that is eventually going to be 50% renewable. So here's Germany, and they're going to be the solar and wind dynamos of the world eventually. And they're going to figure it out. So they're building their own availability. They're building their own reliability. They're going to optimize sustainability, and they're going to sacrifice affordability. And they're going to take some risk in reliability because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And the other problem is, up till now, most energy experts will tell you you really can't have more than 20% renewable in your overall energy grid because it's too unreliable and it causes too much disruption. When there's a lot of it and it's trying to flow back into the grid, it causes problems. And when there isn't enough of it, you've got to have something to replace it with. But Germany Well, they're Germans. And they're going to figure this out. They have scientists, they have engineers, they have Ulrich, right? So Germany, if you look at this chart, what it shows you, the brown columns are showing you demand. And the colorful columns are showing you just renewable energy that they're going to push into their grid. So what you have is they're going to basically attack both supply and demand. They're going to rely upon a fifth fuel, Jennifer. Fifth fuel is?
It is,
It rhymes with efficiency. Efficiency? Efficiency, there it is. So Jennifer is in my elective, and clearly, yes. Yes. So they're gonna drive down demand with efficiency. It is the fifth fuel. And you do see, when you look at different countries and how efficient they are, it's very telling to see who's actually self-sufficient and who isn't. Russia has a horrible ratio of how much energy it takes to produce a unit of GDP, whereas Europe is really high. And it's because it's more expensive, and it's because it's demand-driven. How else are we going to drive down demand? Do you let your kids leave the lights on?
Back to work.
Back to work? Oh, you bike to work, yes. But they're driving down demand also by raising prices significantly in the domestic market. So you pay a lot of money for electricity if you're a German living in a residence. But they're going to drive down demand, they're going to drive up efficiency, and they're going to build a renewable grid. Now, we're all going to benefit from that if they figure it out. But from a technical perspective, it's going to be very challenging. I'm very excited to see what happens with it, because a 50% renewable grid is pretty amazing. But again, it's as a result of where they sit in the world, how they see the energy patterns around them, and how they decided to basically provide for their own energy security. Because remember, everybody else is competing for it, right? Just like physical security. We're all competing for the same thing. Now, we talked about where they get the gas from. They get it from Russia. Now, the one illity that this particular plan is not going to pass is the electability, right? Because when the power goes out or the electric prices stay high, people are not going to be happy. So this really does take a national effort that everybody's willing to participate in order to achieve. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Now, Japan is in a similar situation because they're isolated, and they import a lot, almost all of their energy as well, heavily reliant upon imports. And because of that, they adopted a nuclear focus. Again, because it was available and because it was reliable. And also because they were willing to accept the risk of affordability and sustainability. But you remember we looked at that first slide and we saw that their self-sufficiency dropped below 10%, and that's because nuclear energy suddenly became unacceptable in Japan. In fact, so much so that all nuclear generation came to a grinding halt after the tsunami and the accident that occurred at Fukushima. People would rather sit in the cold and dark than risk a similar event happening. Rolling blackouts and sustained outages, and they're just now getting some of their nuclear generation back online. But what's next for Japan? So Japan had to have a change of heart. This is what Japan's energy mix looked like before Fukushima and after Fukushima. And you can see the big change is in LNG, liquid natural gas. So Japan's got a problem, right? Because they've got to get liquid natural gas into their country so they can provide electricity. So they need supply. Now, fortunately, not all countries are net importers, because if they were, that would be quite a different world we would be living in, right? But fortunately, we have producers. So what's it like to be a producer? Well, sometimes you think you have the Midas touch, because everything you touch kind of turns into gold. And really, there's three different types of exporters. There's producers, there's prosumers, like the United States, we're a producer and a consumer, and then there's petrostates. Now, a petrostate is a state where petroleum makes up more than 50% of their export revenues, more than 25% of their GDP, or more than 25% of their government revenues. They often suffer from boom and bust cycles. I'm going to show you a slide that illustrates that. They can suffer from something called Dutch disease, which is the deindustrialization of their economy. And I'll let you talk about that in seminar because it would take too long to explain. It involves economics. there's a repression effect that can occur. Essentially, in a country where there's oil revenues coming in, and those revenues are being used to fund the government, there's no need to tax the people. Well, without taxation, there's no representation. Without representation, there's very little accountability. So really where this is a challenge is where you have, say, a new country. Has new resources they discovered, and they're trying to make the decision as to how they're going to play those out, how they're going to use them to their advantage in the future. Those countries have to struggle with how they're going to exploit that resource without falling prey to some of these dangers of being a petrostate. The other thing it does is it really limits your dating opportunities at the annual oil gala, as you can see here. So, while petrostates can appear as having very powerful tools of statecraft at their disposal, it's also the case that it's a two-edged sword, and it cuts both ways. So, like I said before, not all producers are petrostates. If you look here, you'll see that Canada produces 4.3 million barrels a day, about 50% of which is oil sand, and they only consume about 2.4 million. So, Stefan, thank you, because you sent that our way. We appreciate it. Because the United States, while we produce 11.8 or 6 million barrels a day, we consume about 19. So we're down about 7.4 million barrels a day as we go around the world. So who are all the producers if we were to look at them all? Where are they? Here they are. And you can see who the top three are. Right? Saudi Arabia, no surprise there. Russia is number 2. And the United States is actually number 3. This is data from 2012. If I look at the data for 2014, it suggests that the United States has surpassed Russia in overall generation, 11.6 million barrels per day. So that's interesting, right? But how long can they continue to pump at those rates? Because that's kind of the question, because you got to figure out what you're going to do next, right? Well, if you look at what the world reserves are currently, you'll see that Saudi Arabia, at its current rate of production, based on what its reserves are, has about 63 years or so. Russia's got about 26, and the United States only has 11. So that's kind of interesting because it means we only have about 11 good years left, right? Maybe, maybe not. Because what's interesting about petroleum reserves, very counterintuitive, in a Mickey Mouse, apprentice, sorcerer, and the broom kind of way, is it would appear that even though we consume 33 billion barrels of oil a year globally, the amount of oil keeps going up. So the more we use, the more there is. Right? So we should move more, right? Right? No. Now, why is this the case? Proven oil reserves. Where's Mason? There you are, buddy. Proven oil reserves. What are those? Do you remember?
They are reserves that are profitable to take from the ground.
Exactly. They have basically 3 features to them. There's Mickey Mouse getting trampled by the brooms. All right, so proven oil reserves are the reserves that you have a 90% probability of profitably recovering them with existing technology and current market conditions. So existing technology and current market condition. So what keeps changing? Technology, right? Fracking, things like that, and the price going up, right? So as the price goes up, we'll have more oil, in theory, right? Or we'll develop technological ways in order to get at it. It'll be interesting to see what happens here in 2016 when we look at those numbers again. But here, let's look at what a nation's break-even price is for its oil. This is the cost for a nation that, it's not everybody, but it's some of them. This is their cost of getting the oil out of the ground and getting it to market. So what you see there is interesting, right? If oil's below $30 a barrel, who's making money on oil? Yeah, Saudi Arabia is, right? So Saudi Arabia, $7, right? What is it? It's $3. It costs them more to transport it than it does to get it out of the ground because it's just sitting right there, right? It's Jed Clampett shooting for some food. Bam. And up from the ground comes a bubbling crude, right? That's Saudi Arabia. But if you're Canada, what's it cost you to get your oil out of the ground and get it to market? Too much. That's right, Stefan. It costs too much, right? $105. That's the break even. Okay? That's the break even price. So, in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, well, if it's above that price, that's good, right? We're making money. Maybe, maybe not. Because remember, how many times can I sell that barrel of oil, PJ? One time, right? I sell it one time and then it's gone. It's not like growing